Welcome to Spicer and Company. I'm Lyndsay Keith. Sean is off for the night. Well, the ex-Minneapolis police officer charged with murder and manslaughter in the death of George Floyd remains behind bars after spending his first night in a maximum security prison. And right now, he is being closely watched by guards for not only suicide risk, but also to protect him from other inmates who may wish to harm him ahead of his sentencing, which happens in 8 weeks. And if you watched Derek Chauvin being taken into custody yesterday, you may have noticed this. Take a close look at his hands. Reports say Chauvin scribbled his lawyer's phone number on his hand, anticipating having his bail revoked because he knew he would only have one phone call, and that would be to his lawyer. But first, tensions are still high around the country. Protests took to the streets, and for all different reasons in the past 24 hours. Some were celebrating Floyd's life peacefully, and others, well, they were not. In Portland, Oregon, a protester actually sucker punched an officer who was on a bike. Meanwhile, in New York City, BLM protesters heckled diners while chanting, "Stay," an expletive that I cannot say, out of New York. They also stated that the owner of this restaurant, who protesters claim was white, was not welcome in New York City. Well, in the midst of this chaos, another police-involved incident occurred. Just 30 minutes before the verdict was handed down in the Chauvin trial, a Columbus, Ohio police officer shot and killed a 16-year-old African-American girl after she allegedly attempted to cut 2 other people with a knife. Police released body cam footage showing the police officer taking action to protect another young girl. And you can see the girl in the black shirt moving towards another young woman with what appears to be a knife in her hand. Well, in response to that shooting in Columbus, protesters took to the streets once again. At one point, you could hear them saying, maybe it needs to be an eye for an eye. Well, if you remember, just yesterday, President Biden said he was praying for a guilty verdict in the Chauvin trial before it came down. And last night, President Biden addressed the nation on the trial again after the verdict came down as guilty. Listen.
No one should be above the law. And today's verdict sends that message. But it's not enough. We can't stop here. In order to deliver real change and reform, we can and we must do more to reduce the likelihood that tragedies like this will ever happen and occur again.
Well, in just a few minutes, we're going to speak to our legal panel on potential grounds for an appeal for Derek Chauvin and what this means for the other 3 officers who are still waiting for their trial, which comes this August. But first, let's go outside of Minneapolis to the Brooklyn Center, where people have been protesting all day. Our national correspondent, Logan Raddick, is there. He's been in Minnesota for the past couple of days. Logan, thanks for joining us. What have you been seeing the last 24 hours?
Well, we had a full day, Lindsay. We started off at the George Floyd Memorial, the George Floyd Square, which is outside of downtown Minneapolis. There were people gathered there celebrating. They were chanting. They were also honoring him with a candlelight vigil. We went to the facility where Derek Chauvin is in solitary confinement. We were the first network there to show pictures of that scene. He's staying 25 miles east of Minneapolis, right near the Wisconsin border. But right here in Brooklyn Center, this is where people think that the unrest could continue in this area because we're still learning more about the officer-involved shooting of the 20-year-old Dante Wright. You can see behind me, there's really nobody here outside of the Brooklyn Center Police Department around 5 o'clock Central Time. And if you take a look to the left right now, you can see the devastation that took place last week with the rioting. It's boarded up. This Dollar Tree was looted and burned, and that really is the impact here in Brooklyn Center. But the question is, when will we maybe see more demonstrations here? People are celebrating the verdict against Derek Chauvin, but with the funeral of Dante Wright tomorrow, Reverend Al Sharpton set to speak, that could bring that issue back into the spotlight because we've heard a lot about what's going on in Columbus and other cities. But Dante Wright will be back at the spotlight tomorrow, and the people who are leading this activism effort have been saying, you can't stop the revolution. We've seen Death to America spray painted on traffic barriers. The rhetoric I've heard here is unlike anything I've heard in my life. There are people who said maybe a civil war would help the country, some real extreme rhetoric. We haven't seen too much violence since we've been here, particularly because of the guilty verdict, but what we have heard has been explosive rhetoric.
Well, Logan, thanks for your time, for the insight there on the ground. Hope to check back with you soon. All right, well, Attorney General Merrick Garland has announced the Department of Justice will open an investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department practices. Take a listen to him describing the purpose of this investigation.
It will assess the effectiveness of the MPD's current systems of accountability and whether other mechanisms are needed to ensure constitutional and lawful policing.
All right, to discuss, let's bring in our legal panel, constitutional law attorney Amir Benno and former prosecutor Nicole DeBoard. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Nicole, I'm going to start with you. We know the DOJ is looking for unlawful use of force in the department there. If the DOJ does find that they are guilty of using too much force, what are the ramifications?
Actually, I think that they're even going to be looking more broadly than that for anything they can find dealing with policies for how they deal with use of force once it happens, how they train regarding the use of force. And I think that this creates a big problem, quite frankly, for the next officers who are scheduled to be on trial, because while this investigation is pending, if I'm a lawyer for these officers, I want to have access to the information that they're uncovering in this next and upcoming investigation.
We had constitutional law expert Alan Dershowitz on our show yesterday, Amir, and here's what he said. Listen.
The judge made a terrible mistake by not sequestering the jury. So the judge himself said this case may be reversed on appeal. And I think it might be reversed on appeal. I think it should be reversed on appeal.
Many people saying there is this opportunity for appeal. Do you agree?
Well, there's certainly an opportunity for appeal, and I think there's many good grounds for appeal. Before you even get to the evidence in this case, there are some questions whether or not the murder charges that were lodged against Derek Chauvin can even be recognized. Felony murder typically cannot exist when the felony connected to the death is an assault. Many courts have held that. A Minnesota Supreme Court, this case took place in Minnesota. So the high court of that state is dealing in another criminal case, but the same issue, whether or not the depraved indifference murder count, that is the murder 3 count, can apply when it's a one-on-one case, when the police officer versus one victim, as opposed to, say, doing something like shooting a gun into a crowd of people. That could result in an overturned verdict. And there's a case right now before the United States Supreme Court arising out of the Boston Marathon bombing, where the bomber in that case, his criminal conviction was overturned because the judge did not conduct an appropriate inquiry of the potential jurors into their exposure to pretrial publicity. Depending on what the Supreme Court says in that case, all of the charges against Chauvin could be tossed out. And that's before we even get to the facts of Chauvin's trial.
Well, let's talk about the judge for a minute, because many people are criticizing him for his handling of this. This was a very public trial. We've been in a case, for that matter. We've been seeing it for almost a year now, trial obviously in the last few weeks. But Nicole, how should have the judge handled the juror or the jury?
Once the defense made the request to have the jurors sequestered, it probably would have been the safest move on the part of Judge Cahill to go ahead and do that, because the defense was signaling to the court, look, we're worried that these jurors are going to have exposure to information that's outside the courtroom, and we don't want that involved in their decision. And if the judge had just sequestered the jury at that time, it would have eliminated the risk that we now see could be there, that they have been exposed to all of what was happening outside this courtroom.
Amir, I've heard some people saying that this should have actually been in a different city completely. Should that be a new precedent for big cases like this moving forward?
Well, this isn't the first case that there's been a question of whether the venue should be transferred. This was brought up before the trial judge here early on in the case, and he rejected that application. And the reason that he rejected it is he said because this was a case that had garnered so much attention, in fact, international attention, that there was no place that they could transfer this case to that would result in jurors who are not familiar with the facts or who are not emotionally connected to it. He also raised some concerns over if you transfer this case to a venue where they perhaps don't have as large enough facility that security could be an issue for the court personnel and the witnesses and the jury. So they wanted to keep it in the city. He pointed to the fact that when you have it in a more metropolitan area, jury selection, you get a larger jury pool to draw from, and you have this opportunity to question the jurors about their exposure to pretrial publicity and hopefully be able to exclude those who say they cannot be impartial. So I don't think we're seeing a precedent by this case.
Nicole, Amir, thanks for your insight. This story is not going away. Hope to have you back.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.
Hey, I'm Rob Finnerty. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please join the conversation in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, too. Hit the bell icon to be alerted to breaking news. And remember, there's a whole lot more on Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news network. Newsmax TV, we're real news for real people.